My husband and my college roommate just welcomed a perfect set of twins. Instead of screaming, I quietly signed away our 5-year marriage without shedding a single tear. But when he proudly carried those newborns into his family's Charleston mansion, his aristocratic mother didn't smile. The color drained from her face as she stared at the little boy's features. "He doesn't know, does he?" she whispered. Back in my Boston office, I wasn't drafting a revenge text. I was opening a corporate audit. The sudden vibration of my phone broke the sterile quiet of my office. The screen displayed Marcus's name. I swiped to answer, placing the device on the cool glass of my desk. I did not speak first. I let the silence stretch, forcing him to fill the void. His voice crackled through the speaker, dripping with a rehearsed, synthetic sympathy that barely masked his underlying arrogance. He wanted to make sure I had seen the photographs. He wanted to ensure I fully understood the magnitude of his new, perfect reality. He spoke of the nursery they had decorated, the warmth Vanessa brought to his mornings, and the sheer biological triumph of having a healthy boy and girl in one perfect delivery. He was waiting for the fracture in my voice. He wanted the tears, the desperate questions, the hysterical accusations. That was the emotional currency he needed to validate his betrayal. If I screamed, he could tell himself I was unstable. If I cried, he could pity me and feel like a benevolent victor. Instead, I gave him nothing. I leaned back in my leather chair, watching the rain streak across the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Boston skyline. I processed his words the exact same way I processed a severely depreciated corporate asset. There was no anger, only a cold, clinical assessment of a bad investment. I offered a flat, monotone congratulations. I asked if they had registered for gifts yet, keeping my tone as sterile as a bank lobby. The line went dead quiet. I could practically hear his triumphant smile shattering into confusion. He quickly ended the call, mumbling something about Vanessa needing him. The penthouse felt remarkably expansive now that his tailored suits and vintage watches were gone. I had spent the past week meticulously cataloging every joint asset, every shared equity stake, and every mutual fund. It was not a grieving process. It was a professional liquidation. He genuinely believed that because I did not weep, I was the cold, unfeeling machine he and Vanessa claimed me to be. They mistook my composure for surrender. They failed to realize that for a woman who reconstructs bankrupt corporations for a living, a failed marriage is simply a contract that requires an immediate and ruthless termination. Once the screen went dark, I pulled up the master financial dashboard of his commercial real estate empire. This was the behemoth I had restructured, optimized, and saved from the brink of federal liquidation. As my eyes scanned the consolidated cash flow statements for the current quarter, my mind easily filtered out the noise of his new family. I was looking for patterns. I was looking for the microscopic fractures in the foundation. It did not take long. My fingers danced across the keyboard, cross-referencing the operational expenses with the primary construction fund of his flagship downtown development. A persistent, highly unusual anomaly caught my attention. It was buried deep within a vendor payment ledger, masked under generic consulting fees. A sum of $15,000 was bleeding out of the project accounts every single month. I pulled the raw data logs, my heart rate steady and completely unchanged. The math never lied. Looking at the glowing numbers on my monitors, the memory of exactly how this empire was salvaged flooded my mind. 5 years ago, Marcus was drowning. His aggressive expansion strategy had triggered a massive liquidity crisis, bringing federal regulators straight to his doorstep. He was facing a potential 5-year federal penalty and total corporate dissolution. He had sat on the floor of our apartment, his head in his hands, begging me to use my professional network and my restructuring expertise to fix his catastrophic mistakes. I did not hesitate. I believed we were partners building a shared legacy. I took a leave of absence from my senior advisory role. For 6 agonizing months, I lived on black coffee and adrenaline. I gutted his bloated operational budget, negotiated viciously with aggressive creditors, and completely rebuilt his compliance protocols from the ground up. I untangled years of chaotic accounting, shielding him from the federal auditors while constructing a bulletproof financial architecture that eventually attracted premier institutional investors. I was the invisible shield that kept him out of prison and put him back on the cover of prestigious real estate magazines. But gratitude has a notoriously short shelf life. Once the ink dried on the new investment rounds and his company achieved massive profitability, his perspective shifted. He no longer saw me as his savior. He saw me as a walking reminder of his own incompetence. I knew the exact depth of his failures, and that knowledge made him deeply insecure. I remembered the exact evening he finally voiced his resentment. We were standing in the kitchen, the city lights reflecting off the marble countertops. He had just closed a major acquisition, entirely funded by the pristine credit rating I had secured for him. Instead of celebrating, he looked at me with profound distaste. He told me our marriage felt like a board meeting. He said I lacked the softness, the maternal warmth that a successful man required to feel truly grounded. He needed a woman who could make him feel like a king, not a woman who scrutinized his balance sheets. I had absorbed those words in silence, burying the hurt beneath a facade of professionalism. I had sacrificed my own career trajectory, my sleep, and my peace of mind to elevate him, only to be branded a heartless machine. That was when Vanessa effortlessly slid into the picture. My former college roommate, a public relations director with a talent for flattering fragile male egos. She gave him the wide-eyed admiration he craved, while I was busy in the background ensuring their lavish lifestyle remained solvent. They bonded over my supposed emotional barrenness. They convinced themselves that their illicit affair was a grand, tragic romance, justified by my failure to provide a warm, traditional home. As I stared at the divorce decree sitting next to my keyboard, the sheer audacity of his narrative crystallized in my mind. He truly believed he could discard the architect and keep the building. The paper felt like ice. I dragged my attention back to the glowing anomaly on my screen. The recurring bleed of $15,000. I ran a deep forensic trace on the routing numbers, bypassing the superficial vendor labels. The funds were not staying domestic. They were being systematically funneled through a sophisticated offshore shell company registered in the Caribbean before being bounced back into a highly restricted domestic trust account. It was a classic obfuscation technique, one usually reserved for hiding illicit corporate kickbacks or evading heavy taxation. Marcus was arrogant, but he was rarely this meticulously deceptive on his own. As I dug through the archived digital vaults to map the origin of this specific corporate account, my cursor hovered over a deeply buried subfolder. It was a repository of the foundational legal documents from the crisis 5 years ago. I opened a specific file. The title read, Irrevocable Proxy Agreement and Clawback Clause, during the darkest days of his insolvency, when he desperately needed an injection of $12 million to satisfy the federal regulators. I had mandated these strict protective covenants. He had signed them in a blind panic, completely ignoring the microscopic legal print. He had long forgotten they existed. I certainly had not. These documents granted me absolute, unchallengeable authority to seize and liquidate core corporate assets if specific financial breaches occurred. It was a dormant weapon, waiting silently in the digital dark. I minimized the legal file and returned to the money trail. The final destination of the laundered $15,000 was heavily guarded, but my high-level banking clearances provided the necessary access. The funds were not going to a mistress's luxury boutique or a secret real estate holding. The receiving institution was fully licensed, highly discreet, and specialized in elite medical services. The sheer irony of the situation was a masterpiece of human delusion. Marcus had publicly crucified me for my alleged biological failures. He had paraded Vanessa in front of our social circle, boasting about her effortless fertility and their divine blessing of twins. He had used her pregnancy as the ultimate moral justification to brutally sever our marriage. Yet, here on my screen was the undeniable mathematical proof that their flawless natural miracle was nothing more than a heavily financed, clinically engineered transaction, paid for by the very corporate treasury I had built. I cross-referenced the corporate registration of the receiving entity. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together, forming a picture so grotesque and pathetic it almost made me laugh out loud. The money was not being embezzled for corporate gain. It was paying for a highly specialized, intensely private service. I pulled up the clinic's public-facing website, reading the discreet gold lettering across their landing page. They offered premium, confidential third-party reproductive assistance for high-net-worth individuals. The monthly corporate hemorrhage was funding Vanessa's miraculous, supposedly natural pregnancy. It was a fertility clinic. Before I could fully process the implications of the medical payments, the secure line on my desk chimed. The caller identification displayed a name that instantly dissolved my cold detachment. It was Gloria. She was an elderly widow, the sister of Marcus's late father, and the only member of his aristocratic family who had ever treated me with genuine, unconditional warmth. During the years I spent locked in my office saving her nephew's business, she would quietly bring me homemade dinners and offered gentle words of encouragement. I answered the call, my voice softening instinctively, but there was no cheerful greeting waiting on the other end. I heard the unmistakable, ragged sound of an old woman trying desperately to suppress her weeping. Gloria's voice trembled so violently she could barely form coherent sentences. She told me she had just received a certified courier package from Marcus's elite legal team. The documents were a formal notification of a massive restructuring within the family investment portfolio. 5 years ago, when Marcus was facing federal ruin and every bank had denied him credit, it was Gloria who stepped forward. Based entirely on her absolute trust in my financial projections, she had quietly mortgaged her beloved historic retirement home. She had liquidated her deceased husband's entire pension to provide a critical $12 million capital injection that kept Marcus out of prison. In return, she was guaranteed a fixed, generous monthly dividend to sustain her through her final years. Now, Marcus was cutting her off. Gloria choked on her tears as she read the legal jargon to me. The lawyers claimed that due to necessary corporate expansion and recent market volatility, the company was invoking a vague, previously dormant hardship clause to indefinitely suspend all secondary dividend distributions. It was a masterclass in corporate cruelty. Without that monthly income, Gloria would default on the heavy mortgage she took out to save him. She would lose the home she had lived in for 40 years. Marcus was effectively throwing the woman who rescued him out onto the street, simply to free up more liquid capital for his lavish new life with Vanessa. He was currently planning a massive, ostentatious christening party at the family estate in Charleston to celebrate his new heirs. He was preparing to stand before the wealthiest elites in the state, projecting the image of a benevolent patriarch. Meanwhile, he was signing legal directives to bankrupt his own elderly aunt in the shadows. He assumed that because I was officially removed from the family tree, there was no one left to analyze the fine print of his cruelty. He assumed Gloria would just quietly fade away, too frightened to fight back. I sat perfectly still, listening to her quiet, terrified sobbing. The analytical detachment I had maintained since signing the divorce papers shattered completely, replaced by a terrifying, focused rage. Betraying me was a business miscalculation, but destroying a helpless, trusting old woman to fund a lifestyle built on lies was an unforgivable moral crime. I promised her, in a voice as solid as iron, that she would not lose her home. I hung up the phone and looked back at the glowing screens. I picked up the pen. As I laid out the foundational documents of the irrevocable proxy on my desk, I allowed myself a rare moment of brutal self-reflection. I needed to dissect my own complicity in this disaster. Why had I stayed for 5 years in a marriage that felt like a permanent corporate crisis? Why had I accepted his coldness, his subtle degradations, and his constant demands for more of my intellect and less of my humanity? The answer was a bitter psychological phenomenon I called the chain of competence. It is a silent, suffocating trap that ensnares highly capable women. We are conditioned to believe that our ultimate value lies in our utility. When the man we love creates a catastrophe, we do not walk away. We step in. We roll up our sleeves. We analyze the damage, and we fix it. We untangle the chaotic ledgers. We appease the furious creditors, and we absorb the immense stress of their failures. We convince ourselves that by saving them, we are proving our indispensable worth. We believe that if we can just fix this one massive problem, they will finally look at us with the deep, unwavering love and respect we crave. But that is the fatal flaw in the equation. Competence does not inspire romantic devotion in a fragile, narcissistic ego. It inspires a deep, festering resentment. Every time Marcus looked at me, he did not see a loving partner. He saw the woman who witnessed him at his absolute weakest. He saw the auditor who knew every single one of his professional sins. I had built a fortress around his reputation, but to him, it felt like a prison. He resented the chain of competence that bound him to my intellect. He wanted to feel like a powerful titan, and he could never achieve that delusion while standing next to the woman who literally built his throne. I had treated my marriage like a balance sheet, constantly trying to offset his emotional deficits with my operational surpluses. I thought I could manage the risk of his character flaws the same way I managed market volatility. But human cruelty cannot be hedged. By continually absorbing the consequences of his actions, I had inadvertently trained him to believe he was invincible. I had shielded him from the natural repercussions of his incompetence for so long that he genuinely believed he was untouchable. He felt perfectly comfortable discarding me and destroying Gloria because I had spent 5 years proving that I would always clean up the collateral damage. My flawless financial architecture, the very systems I designed to shield his wealth, were now being weaponized against an innocent old woman. I had unknowingly built the exact administrative machinery he was using to bankrupt his own aunt. My blind loyalty had not just destroyed my marriage, it had endangered a vulnerable victim. The realization was a heavy, suffocating weight in my chest. That era of invisible servitude was officially over. I would no longer be his safety net. I was going to be the concrete floor he smashed into. The armor had to break. The digital public relations campaign began exactly 3 days after the divorce papers were finalized. Vanessa, a seasoned media director, knew exactly how to control a narrative. She did not just want to steal a wealthy real estate developer. She wanted to be publicly canonized for doing it. I sat in my home office, sipping a glass of iced sparkling water, scrolling through an exclusive lifestyle feature published in Boston's most prominent society magazine. The headline read, "Building a Real Home, The surprising romance that saved a commercial titan. The article featured a multi-page spread of Marcus and Vanessa lounging in their freshly renovated historic townhouse. Vanessa wore a flowing, immaculate white dress, cradling her pregnant belly with an expression of manufactured, angelic sweetness. Marcus stood behind her, looking like a conquering patriarch who had finally secured his legacy. The text of the interview was a masterclass in passive-aggressive assassination. Without ever explicitly saying my name, Vanessa painted a portrait of a previous marriage that was a frozen, desolate wasteland. She spoke softly about how Marcus had suffered for years in a house completely devoid of maternal warmth. Shackled to a woman who treated him like a corporate subsidiary, she claimed they had fought their feelings for years out of loyalty. But true love and the miraculous, spontaneous blessing of twin babies had ultimately forced their hands. She positioned herself as his savior, the fertile, loving sanctuary he had been desperately seeking. The comment sections across social media platforms were flooded with high society acquaintances offering their tearful congratulations. They openly pitied Marcus for the cold years he had endured with me, and praised Vanessa for giving him a real family. It was a perfectly executed public execution of my character. I did not leave a single angry comment. I did not call our mutual friends to defend my reputation. In the world of crisis management, fighting a carefully constructed emotional narrative with logical defense only makes you look desperate and guilty. You never argue with a fraudulent public relations campaign. You simply locate the structural defect in their story and pull the fundamental support pillar. I close the magazine article and open Vanessa's personal Instagram feed. I scrolled back through months of her carefully curated pregnancy journey. My eyes stopped on a specific photograph posted 5 months prior. It was a candid shot of Vanessa holding a generic ultrasound printout, captioned with excessive heart emojis. She had blurred the medical details, but the cropping was sloppy. The top right corner of the paper displayed a highly distinctive, stylized crest. It was a blue lotus flower intertwined with a medical cross. It was the exact same logo I had found on the offshore vendor payment ledger earlier that morning. Vanessa had claimed her pregnancy was a beautiful, natural accident, a testament to her profound physical connection with Marcus. But the logo on her ultrasound did not belong to a standard obstetrician. The logo was not obstetric. Staring at that blue lotus logo, my mind drifted back to a rainy afternoon 8 months ago, sitting in Gloria's modest, antique-filled living room. It was the last time I had genuinely tried to protect the Montgomery family from itself. I had driven out to the suburbs specifically to review Gloria's quarterly dividend statements. I had noticed an aggressive new clause Marcus had drafted, one that allowed him to delay her payments during periods of aggressive corporate acquisition. I knew exactly what that meant. He was preparing to leverage her retirement security to fund his reckless new Midtown commercial tower. I had sat on the velvet sofa, holding Gloria's fragile, arthritic hands, gently explaining the financial risks she was exposed to. I told her she needed to demand an independent legal review before signing any further addendums. Gloria had listened, her eyes wide with worry. But before she could agree, the front door had swung open. Marcus had walked in, bringing Vanessa with him. Vanessa had immediately glided across the room, carrying a basket of fresh, expensive pastries, kneeling beside Gloria's chair with an expression of absolute devotion. Vanessa had touched Gloria's arm, speaking in a soft, musical cadence. She had assured the elderly widow that Marcus was simply securing the family legacy, that the new building would guarantee her wealth for generations. She subtly positioned my caution as paranoid, corporate pessimism. She told Gloria that family was about blind faith, not audited spreadsheets. Marcus had stood by, watching Vanessa work her manipulative magic with a smug, satisfied smirk. He loved how Vanessa made his predatory greed look like noble ambition. Under the combined weight of her nephew's charm and Vanessa's toxic sweetness, Gloria had relented. She had signed the restrictive addendum right there on the coffee table, waving away my warnings. I had left the house that day feeling a profound, sickening helplessness. I could not legally block the signature without filing a formal complaint against the firm I was simultaneously trying to save. I had to watch the predator embrace the prey. But as I sat in my Boston penthouse in the present day, pulling up a digital scan of that exact addendum from my encrypted archives, the helplessness evaporated. I zoomed in on the final page, examining the execution signatures. Marcus had been in such a rush to secure her equity that he had cut corners. The document required the signature of a certified notary public and an independent witness who was not a direct beneficiary of the corporation. Marcus had used a junior associate from his own legal department to witness the signing, a blatant conflict of interest under state financial statutes. The addendum was deeply flawed. The witness signature was invalid. The following morning, I initiated my exit protocol. I did not storm into the corporate headquarters to demand a dramatic confrontation. Instead, I leased a sterile, nondescript executive suite in a quiet business park across the city. To the outside world, and specifically to Marcus and his network, I projected the image of a defeated woman retreating into isolation. I stopped attending industry galas. I let my public professional profiles go dormant. I wanted them to believe that the divorce had completely shattered my confidence, leaving me paralyzed in my quiet apartment. The illusion of my misery was the perfect camouflage for my audit. Behind the closed doors of my new, heavily encrypted workspace, I was orchestrating a massive, systematic extraction. The irrevocable proxy agreement I had forced Marcus to sign 5 years ago granted me the unilateral authority to reclaim my initial capital injection, plus compounded market appreciation, in the event of a material breach of fiduciary duty. Rerouting project funds to a private offshore account to pay for a secret medical procedure was the textbook definition of a material breach. I did not alert his accounting department. I bypassed his internal financial controllers entirely, using my senior administrative credentials, which he had arrogantly forgotten to revoke. I accessed the central holding trust that managed his liquid commercial assets. Over the course of 72 hours, I executed a series of highly complex, staggered wire transfers. I liquidated $25 million in shared equity and corporate reserves, legally severing my financial lifeblood from his empire. I routed the capital through 3 independent audited escrow accounts before depositing it securely into a private trust registered solely in my name. It was a surgical financial strike. I left just enough operating capital in his primary accounts to cover his daily payroll and his immediate construction liabilities, ensuring the automated banking alerts would not trigger an immediate red flag. He would be able to buy Vanessa expensive jewelry and host lavish dinners for another week without noticing a single issue. But the structural integrity of his entire organization was now gone. The massive cash reserves he required to satisfy his upcoming quarterly commercial loan covenants had vanished into thin air. I watched the final transfer confirmation screen flash green, verifying the settlement of the funds. My breathing remained steady and calm. 40% simply evaporated. With my $25 million securely ring-fenced, I turned my absolute focus to the $15,000 anomaly. The Blue Lotus logo from Vanessa's ultrasound led me to the Prime Genesis Reproductive Institute. It was a boutique clinic nestled in a highly discreet commercial district, renowned for servicing clients who demanded absolute privacy regarding their genetic choices. Marcus believed he was paying for premium prenatal care. But prenatal care does not require routing funds through a Caribbean shell company. I needed the clinic's internal billing metadata. As a senior risk analyst, I maintained extensive, quiet relationships with independent data compliance auditors across various sectors. A few carefully placed phone calls, leveraging favors owed from past corporate restructurings, yielded a redacted but highly informative data packet. The packet contained the time-stamped entry logs and encrypted billing codes for Vanessa's patient file. The data revealed that Vanessa had begun visiting the clinic 8 months before she officially announced her pregnancy. She had undergone a specialized procedure categorized under the code for third-party in vitro fertilization, but the most glaring piece of data was the secondary profile attached to her account. The clinic required a biological donor identifier. Vanessa's file was linked to an anonymous profile simply labeled Donor K9. I exported the date and timestamps of every single appointment donor K9 had attended at the clinic. I then opened a separate, deeply unpleasant file, Caleb Montgomery. Marcus's younger cousin was a notorious degenerate gambler, a man who floated through the family gatherings asking for loans he never intended to repay. Marcus despised him, yet kept him on a nominal corporate retainer to appease their grandmother. I had access to Caleb's corporate credit card logs, a card Marcus allowed him to use for basic living expenses. I laid the two data sets side by side on my massive digital monitors. I cross-referenced the dates donor K9 was required to be at the Prime Genesis Clinic in Boston, with Caleb's geographical transaction history. On March 12th, donor K9 checked into the clinic at 9 in the morning. Caleb's corporate card purchased coffee 2 blocks away at 8:45. On April 18th, donor K9 had a mandatory screening. Caleb's card paid for a parking garage directly underneath the clinic building. The pattern repeated perfectly across 7 distinct medical appointments. The math was flawless, absolute, and utterly devastating. The donor code matched perfectly. The entire grotesque architecture of Vanessa's deception finally crystallized in my mind. She had not experienced a miraculous, spontaneous pregnancy. She possessed the same ruthless, calculating ambition that Marcus did, but she lacked the intelligence to mask her tracks. Vanessa knew that to permanently secure Marcus and his vast fortune, she needed to deliver the one thing I supposedly could not, an heir. But she also understood the fanatical obsession the Montgomery family, particularly Eleanor, had with their aristocratic, old money bloodline. An anonymous sperm donor would never pass a future genetic health screening or a casual family resemblance test. So, Vanessa made a coldly pragmatic decision. She purchased the biology she needed from the weakest link in the family chain. Caleb was deeply in debt, desperate for cash, and completely devoid of moral boundaries. He was the perfect, easily manipulated vessel. He provided the genetic material, ensuring the twin babies would possess the requisite Montgomery features and DNA markers to pass any standard scrutiny. In exchange, Vanessa promised to clear his massive underground casino debts. But Vanessa did not use her own money to pay Caleb. She used her position as Marcus's new partner to authorize fraudulent consulting invoices, siphoning $8,500 at a time from the primary construction fund of Marcus's new commercial tower. She routed those funds offshore, attempting to clean the money before it landed in Caleb's hands. She was stealing from her new husband's business to pay her husband's cousin for the biological material she used to trap her husband. It was an incestuous, fraudulent masterpiece. Marcus had destroyed our 5-year marriage, discarded me like an obsolete piece of software, and publicly humiliated me to the entire social elite of Boston. He had done all of this to build a life with a woman who had orchestrated a massive biological fraud and was actively embezzling his corporate funds to pay for it. He was funding his own profound humiliation. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the compiled dossier on my screen. I did not feel an ounce of pity for the man I had once loved. My mind automatically shifted to the regulatory implications of Vanessa's sloppy money laundering. The offshore transfers she had executed to pay Caleb were clumsy. By breaking the payments into specific increments, she was attempting to avoid federal banking scrutiny, but she had miscalculated the volume. The threshold was severely breached. The digital evidence sitting on my server was a masterpiece of amateur arrogance. Vanessa had clearly watched a few crime documentaries and believed she understood the complexities of international finance. She had deliberately broken the $8,500 payments into staggered intervals. Assuming that keeping the individual transfers under the standard $10,000 reporting threshold would render them completely invisible to regulatory oversight. This is a common, highly illegal practice known as structuring. She assumed she was outsmarting the system, playing the role of a brilliant corporate strategist while using Marcus's wealth to cover up her biological deception. She was devastatingly wrong. Modern banking compliance does not rely on simple, static thresholds anymore. The financial infrastructure of the United States utilizes highly sophisticated, automated algorithmic monitoring systems designed to detect velocity, frequency, and suspicious geographical routing. By consistently funneling thousands of dollars from a registered domestic commercial construction fund into a newly formed, opaque holding company in the Caribbean, Vanessa had not hidden her tracks. She had essentially painted a giant, glowing target on Marcus's corporate back. I pulled the global compliance guidelines onto my secondary monitor, reading through the exact protocols her transactions had violated. The system would have automatically flagged the repeated offshore routing. Once flagged, the software would analyze the ultimate destination of the funds. The fact that the money immediately bounced back into a domestic account belonging to an unemployed, heavily indebted individual like Caleb would instantly escalate the alert. This was no longer just a minor corporate discrepancy or a careless accounting error. In the eyes of the federal government, it looked exactly like an organized money laundering syndicate. Vanessa's desperate attempt to hide the truth about the twin babies had inadvertently exposed Marcus's entire real estate empire to a catastrophic federal audit. The Internal Revenue Service and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network did not care about infidelity or broken marriages. They cared about undocumented capital flight. While Vanessa was busy selecting silk dresses for her magazine interviews and curating her image as a devoted, loving mother, federal algorithms were quietly archiving her financial crimes. She had handed the authorities the exact rope needed to hang them both. I sat in the quiet chill of my office, a profound sense of clinical satisfaction washing over me. They had called me a cold, calculating machine. They had mocked my dedication to the numbers, claiming I lacked the emotional depth to understand true human connection. Yet, it was precisely those numbers that were about to serve as their absolute executioner. The digital footprint could never be erased, and the algorithms never accepted apologies. Marcus was busy picking out custom catering menus for his grand Charleston celebration, completely oblivious to the massive legal storm gathering just over his head. I turned away from the glowing monitors and walked toward the heavy glass window of my office. Outside, the Boston skyline was a jagged silhouette against the darkening evening sky. In the reflection of the glass, I saw a woman who had spent 5 years bending her entire existence to accommodate the fragile ego of a mediocre man. I thought about the concept of grace. Society constantly demands that women, especially betrayed women, exhibit endless reservoirs of grace. We are expected to take the high road, to forgive quietly, and to step aside without making a scene when we are abruptly replaced. We are taught that anger is a toxic emotion and that retaliation is a bitter, ugly pursuit. For a long time, I believed that maintaining my silent composure and simply walking away with my divorce papers was the ultimate manifestation of that grace. I thought leaving Marcus to his own inevitable self-destruction was the moral victory, but holding the memory of Gloria's terrified, sobbing voice in my mind completely dismantled that philosophy. What happens when your silent grace is weaponized against the innocent? What happens when your dignified retreat allows a predator to comfortably consume someone who cannot fight back? If I simply walked away now, Marcus would successfully bankrupt his elderly aunt to fund the extravagant lifestyle he was building with Vanessa. My silence would be actively complicit in Gloria's financial ruin. I realized then that true compassion without rigid, enforceable boundaries is nothing more than self-destruction. Sometimes, being truly graceful requires you to pick up the sword, retaliation, when executed with precise, objective justice, is not an act of petty vengeance. It is a necessary moral calibration. It is the act of restoring order to a system that has been deeply corrupted by greed and deceit. I mentally boxed up every lingering shred of nostalgia, every trace of the woman who had spent sleepless nights worrying about Marcus's blood pressure and corporate stress levels. That woman was officially dead, buried beneath the fraudulent legal addendum he had manipulated Gloria into signing. I was returning to my factory settings. I was a senior financial restructuring expert, and I was currently looking at a deeply toxic asset that needed to be aggressively liquidated for the safety of the remaining stakeholders. I walked back to my desk, the leather chair squeaking softly as I sat down. I opened the encrypted master file containing the complete audit of Vanessa's offshore transfers and the verified medical logs from the Prime Genesis Clinic. I organized the data into pristine, undeniable visual charts. There would be no room for emotional manipulation, no space for Vanessa's tears or Marcus's blustering excuses. I was building a cage out of their own verifiable data points, a cage so mathematically sound that no high-priced defense attorney could ever break them out of it. The era of mercy ended. The following Tuesday, a notification chimed on my laptop. It was an urgent priority email forwarded from Marcus's executive assistant, though the condescending syntax was unmistakably his own. The subject line read, "Family restructuring and outstanding liabilities." I opened the message, my expression completely neutral. It was a formal, heavily stylized invitation to the grand christening gala scheduled for the upcoming weekend at the historic Montgomery Estate in Charleston. The digital card was embossed with gold lettering, proudly announcing the official presentation of his twin heirs to the Southern elite. It was a blatant, psychological taunt. He wanted to ensure I saw the magnificent scale of his victory. But the invitation was merely the bait. The true venom was contained in the attached legal memorandum. Marcus's corporate counsel was officially demanding that I voluntarily assume liability for a specific portfolio of heavily defaulted commercial loans. The email arrogantly suggested that since I had managed the initial acquisition phase of those properties 5 years ago, it was my ongoing fiduciary duty to shoulder the burden of their current failure. He was experiencing severe cash flow hemorrhages, partly because I had already silently liquidated $25 million of my equity, and he was desperately trying to offload his toxic garbage onto my pristine credit profile. He wanted me to subsidize his insolvency so he could continue playing the billionaire patriarch in front of his mother, Eleanor. He had the absolute audacity to ask the woman he had betrayed to write him a blank check to cover his administrative incompetence. As if the financial demand was not insulting enough. My eyes drifted to the bottom of the email thread. Vanessa had seamlessly inserted herself into the corporate communication, adding a small, italicized postscript from her personal account. It read, "Marcus and I hope you are finding some peace. Victoria. The babies are thriving. Thank you for making room for our happiness." It was a masterclass in passive-aggressive cruelty, dripping with a venomous, manufactured pity designed to make me feel small and discarded. She wanted me to scream. She wanted me to fire back a long, emotional, bitter tirade that she could proudly show to Marcus and their friends as proof of my unhinged jealousy. They were both desperately poking at the glass of my silence, trying to provoke a reaction to validate their choices. I stared at the screen, listening to the soft hum of the city traffic outside my window. I read the legal demands and the mocking postscript twice, analyzing the profound insecurity radiating from every single syllable. They were terrified of the quiet. I never typed a reply. Instead of engaging in a pathetic, emotional digital shouting match, I chose to respond with absolute, systemic annihilation. I picked up a specialized encrypted mobile device I kept securely locked in my desk drawer. I bypassed my standard contacts and dialed the direct, unlisted extension of a former colleague who now operated as a senior forensic investigator for the Federal Financial Crimes Division. I did not offer any pleasantries, and I did not provide my name. When the secure line clicked open, I simply provided the exact routing sequence of Vanessa's offshore transfers, the specific dates of the $8,500 structuring deposits, and the corresponding corporate identification numbers for Marcus's flagship commercial account. I gave them the precise coordinates of the anomaly, effectively handing the federal authorities a fully illuminated map to a massive money laundering operation. If you have ever received a toxic message and chosen to respond with action instead of words, tell me how you handled it. The federal investigator on the other end remained silent, furiously typing the data into their terminal. They recognized the scale of the violation immediately. With the federal tripwire officially activated, I turned my attention to the domestic battlefield. I contacted my personal legal counsel, a brilliant, ruthlessly efficient attorney who specialized in aggressive corporate litigation. I authorized the immediate formal execution of the irrevocable proxy agreement and the attached clawback covenants. I transmitted the certified logs proving Marcus had fundamentally breached his fiduciary duties by allowing corporate treasury funds to be siphoned for private, illicit medical procedures. My attorney confirmed the receipt of the documents. Her voice was sharp and entirely devoid of hesitation. She informed me that the necessary injunctions would be drafted, notarized, and filed with the federal commercial courts before the end of the business day. The court orders would officially recognize my superior lien on the assets, retroactively validating the $25 million I had already extracted, and placing a lethal, unbreakable legal chokehold on whatever liquidity Marcus believed he still possessed. Every single step I took was mathematically sealed and legally unassailable. I was not operating out of malice or heartbreak. I was executing a standard protocol for asset recovery in a hostile environment. I shut down my secure laptop, the screen going black, reflecting my calm, unwavering expression. Marcus and Vanessa thought they were playing a game of social media optics and high society gossip. They had no idea they had stepped onto a chessboard where I controlled every single piece, and I had already quietly locked the doors from the outside. The dominoes were fully aligned. People often misunderstand how true, devastating power operates in the modern world. They believe that power is screaming loudly in a boardroom, throwing a glass of wine in a crowded restaurant, or launching a desperate, emotional tirade on the internet. But real, unadulterated power is entirely silent. It does not demand attention. It lives in the microscopic print of commercial contracts, in the execution of legal clauses, and in the cold, impartial mechanics of the financial system. Let me explain the precise mechanics of a cross-collateralized clawback clause. The exact weapon I had embedded in Marcus's corporate foundation 5 years ago. When Marcus began his aggressive expansion phase, taking out massive new construction loans to build his vanity commercial towers, the secondary lending institutions required underlying security. Because his new projects carried immense risk, he used the core operating capital of his original, stabilized firm as the primary collateral to guarantee the new debt. It is a standard industry practice, building a house of cards where every floor relies on the stability of the foundation. However, Marcus completely forgot that I held a superior, unchangeable legal lien on that exact foundational capital. The irrevocable proxy meant my claim superseded any subsequent bank loans. When I executed the agreement and legally pulled my $25 million out of his primary accounts, I did not merely drain his available cash, I actively yanked the foundational brick out from underneath his entire corporate architecture. By removing that core collateral, I triggered an automatic, catastrophic default on every single secondary loan he held across his entire portfolio. The sophisticated algorithms at his lending banks would detect the massive collateral shortfall within hours. They would immediately invoke their acceleration clauses, demanding the full, instantaneous repayment of hundreds of millions of dollars in debt that Marcus absolutely did not have. He was currently reviewing catering options and floral arrangements for his grand societal debut in Charleston, completely unaware that his commercial empire had already flatlined. This is the beautiful, absolute purity of justice by documentation. It strips away all the gaslighting, the emotional manipulation, and the polished public relations narratives. It does not matter how many magazine covers Vanessa graces, or how many times Marcus claims I was a cold, unfeeling partner. The federal courts and the institutional banks do not care about his excuses. They only care about the mathematics of insolvency and the verified signatures on a binding legal contract. I had initiated the sequence, and the machine would simply grind him into dust. Signatures always defeat lies eventually. The beauty of a perfectly designed system is that it requires very little manual intervention once the variables are correctly aligned. I did not need to scream at Vanessa in a crowded restaurant. I did not need to hire a private investigator to follow Marcus around the city, desperately trying to catch him in a lie. I simply needed to take the verified, objective data I had extracted from the Prime Genesis servers and place it directly into the hands of the one person whose psychological profile guaranteed an absolute thermonuclear reaction. I sat at my sleek glass desk, carefully organizing the digital printouts. I wore sterile latex gloves, not out of a sense of theatrical paranoia, but because maintaining an immaculate, untraceable chain of custody was a core principle of risk management. I printed the time-stamped entry logs from the fertility clinic. I printed the heavily encrypted billing codes that matched Vanessa's patient profile with the anonymous identifier of donor K9. Finally, I printed the cross-referenced financial statements proving that Marcus's corporate treasury had inadvertently paid for the entire fraudulent procedure. I slid the stack of crisp, heavy parchment papers into a thick brown manila envelope. I did not include a handwritten note. I did not include a dramatic letter outlining my grievances or demanding justice. The data was powerful enough to speak entirely for itself. I printed a single, computerized shipping label. The destination address was the historic Montgomery family estate in Charleston, South Carolina. The recipient was Eleanor Montgomery. Eleanor was a woman entirely defined by her adherence to the rigid, archaic rules of Southern high society. She was an aristocrat who valued her family's genetic lineage and pristine public reputation above the actual lives of her children. She had barely tolerated my marriage to Marcus because I came from a working-class background, despite the fact that my intellect had salvaged her son's fortune. She had enthusiastically embraced Vanessa solely because Vanessa played the role of the submissive, fertile Southern belle perfectly. I knew exactly what would happen when Eleanor opened that envelope. Her aristocratic pride was her greatest vulnerability. The realization that she had been completely duped by a common public relations director would infuriate her. But the undeniable biological proof that her celebrated, highly publicized twin grandchildren were actually the offspring of Caleb, the family's most embarrassing, degenerate gambling addict, would trigger a volcanic eruption of aristocratic humiliation. She would not hide it to protect Marcus. She would actively scorch the earth to purge the deception from her bloodline. I sealed the envelope, handed it to a private, bonded courier service, and paid for overnight priority delivery. I requested signature confirmation upon arrival. The next morning, a small notification pinged silently on my secure mobile device. The package had been successfully delivered to the Charleston estate. It had been signed for by the head of estate security at exactly 10 o'clock in the morning. The trap was permanently set. The bomb was ticking. The morning of the grand christening gala arrived with a brilliant, cloudless sky. I woke up in my Boston penthouse precisely at 6 o'clock. My routine was completely devoid of anxiety or hesitation. I moved through my morning with the disciplined, mechanical precision of a surgeon preparing for a complex, high-stakes operation. I brewed a shot of dark espresso, standing by the window as the city slowly woke up beneath me. Today was not about seeking closure. Today was about finalizing a massive corporate liquidation. I walked into my closet and bypassed the soft, colorful dresses I used to wear to appease Marcus's demands for traditional femininity. I selected a custom-tailored, immaculate black Givenchy business suit. I paired it with a crisp white silk blouse and a pair of 5-inch black stiletto heels. The attire was intentionally severe, sharp, and uncompromising. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, tight chignon, completely removing any trace of softness from my appearance. When I looked in the mirror, I did not see a discarded, heartbroken ex-wife. I saw a senior restructuring executive preparing to execute a hostile takeover. I did not pack a suitcase. I was not staying in South Carolina long enough to require a change of clothes. I picked up a slim, black leather document portfolio. Inside, I placed the notarized, certified execution orders for the irrevocable proxy agreement. Behind that, I placed the stamped confirmations from the federal courts validating my superior lien on the corporate assets. And finally, tucked neatly in the back, was the automated alert from the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, confirming the active investigation into the $8,500 money laundering transfers. I locked the penthouse and took a private car to Logan International Airport. I sat quietly in the first-class lounge, sipping sparkling water, entirely detached from the bustling noise of the travelers around me. We are about to walk into the storm. If you're ready to see absolute justice served, drop a yes in the comments. I boarded the flight to Charleston, plugging in my noise-canceling headphones and reviewing the exact financial parameters of Marcus's impending bankruptcy one last time. Every variable was tracking perfectly. When the plane touched down on the tarmac in South Carolina, the heavy, humid southern air greeted me instantly. I bypassed the baggage claim entirely, walking straight to the executive car rental counter. I picked up the keys to an inconspicuous black sedan and programmed the GPS for the Montgomery family estate. The drive through the historic district was picturesque, lined with ancient weeping oaks and centuries-old cobblestones. It was a beautiful town built on the foundation of maintaining perfect, unbreakable appearances. I gripped the leather steering wheel, my heart rate holding incredibly steady as the massive iron gates of the estate finally appeared in the distance. The street was already lined with expensive luxury vehicles. The Grand Societal Theater was officially in session. The storm was finally here. The Montgomery estate had been transformed into an aggressively expensive spectacle of Southern wealth. As I parked my rental sedan a few blocks away and walked quietly toward the property line, the sheer scale of Marcus's vanity became undeniably apparent. A massive, cream-colored reception tent dominated the manicured front lawn, draped with thousands of pastel pink and blue hydrangeas. A classical string quartet played softly in the background, masking the low, buzzing hum of hundreds of wealthy, influential guests sipping imported champagne. I did not announce my arrival. I slipped seamlessly through the side entrance of the pavilion, blending into the shadows near the catering staging area. From my vantage point, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the main raised platform and the VIP dining tables. Marcus was standing in the center of the stage, holding the infant boy wrapped in blue silk. He wore a bespoke navy suit, his chest puffed out with an intoxicating blend of supreme arrogance and patriarchal pride. Beside him stood Vanessa, holding the infant girl, dressed in a custom blush pink gown, projecting a flawless image of maternal grace. The hired master of ceremonies handed Marcus the microphone. The crowd fell into a respectful silence. Marcus cleared his throat, offering a brilliant, practiced smile to the audience of federal judges, prominent bank presidents, and elite local socialites. He spoke eloquently about the trials of his past, subtly hinting at the cold, unfeeling years he had supposedly endured before finding his true salvation. He turned to Vanessa, his voice dropping into a register of manufactured, intimate devotion, thanking her for giving him the ultimate miracle. He thanked her for providing him with the one thing he had always lacked: a real family. The audience murmured in unified, sympathetic approval. Several wealthy matrons in the front rows actually dabbed at their eyes with silk handkerchiefs. It was a perfectly executed public relations performance. They were watching a titan of industry humbly celebrate his beautiful new dynasty. I stood in the shadows, my expression completely neutral, simply observing the mechanics of his delusion. He genuinely believed his own narrative. My gaze bypassed the happy couple on the stage and locked onto the primary family table positioned directly in the center of the front row. Eleanor Montgomery sat completely rigid in her high-backed mahogany chair. She was wearing a formal royal blue suit, but her aristocratic composure was visibly disintegrating. Her face was the color of wet ash. Her eyes were dark, glassy, and fixed in a terrifying, unblinking stare that completely ignored her son's speech. Her hands were resting on the white linen tablecloth. Beneath her trembling, manicured fingers was the thick brown manila envelope I had mailed from Boston. The flap was torn open. A stack of heavily highlighted medical logs and banking transactions peeked out from the edges. She had clearly spent the entire morning digesting the forensic reality of her family's bloodline. The matriarch was ready. Marcus finished his emotional, self-congratulatory toast by raising his champagne flute toward his mother's table. He smiled broadly, expecting Eleanor to stand and offer the traditional family blessing to the new heirs. The audience waited in polite anticipation. Instead, Eleanor stood up with such sudden, violent force that her heavy wooden dining chair scraped backward against the brick patio with a sharp, piercing screech. The terrible sound sliced cleanly through the elegant classical music, instantly killing the celebratory atmosphere. Marcus lowered his glass, a flicker of genuine annoyance crossing his handsome face. He leaned into the microphone, attempting to maintain the polished facade. He gently asked his mother if she was all right, patronizingly suggesting she sit down until the formal photographs were complete. Eleanor ignored him entirely. She did not look at her son. She stepped away from the table, her designer heels striking the pavement with a heavy, rhythmic intensity as she marched directly toward the stage. She stopped at the bottom of the wooden stairs, her eyes locking onto Vanessa with a glare of pure, unadulterated murder. The absolute silence in the pavilion was suffocating. 300 members of the societal elite held their collective breath. Eleanor reached into the brown manila envelope she was clutching and pulled out the thick stack of Prime Genesis medical logs. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was not a hysterical scream. It was a raspy, guttural hiss that carried perfectly over the silent lawn, dripping with venomous disgust. She demanded that Vanessa look her in the eyes and explain the billing codes. She thrust the medical documents into the air, her hand shaking with uncontrollable, aristocratic rage. Eleanor explicitly detailed the fraudulent in vitro fertilization procedures, reading the dates and times aloud to the horrified crowd. She did not stop there. Her gaze swept aggressively across the catering area until she spotted Caleb, who was frantically trying to duck behind a floral arrangement. Eleanor pointed a rigid, furious finger directly at her nephew, officially identifying him to the entire county as donor K9. The pavilion erupted into absolute chaos. Gasps of horror and loud, scandalous whispers swept through the tables. Vanessa's meticulously crafted public relations persona shattered into pieces. Her face drained of all color as she clutched the crying infant, stumbling backward and frantically shaking her head, stammering out pathetic, incoherent denials. She begged Marcus to defend her, claiming the papers were forged. Marcus stood completely paralyzed, his expensive Italian shoes rooted to the stage. His eyes darted frantically across the medical logs his mother had thrown onto the acrylic podium. He saw Vanessa's signature. He saw Caleb's identifying markers. The crushing realization of his absolute, profound humiliation paralyzed his vocal cords. His beautiful dynasty was a clinical transaction purchased from a degenerate gambler. Desperate, sweating profusely, Marcus grabbed the microphone, his voice cracking as he screamed over the crowd that the allegations were lies, insisting that his corporate empire was still flawless. He was completely wrong. The sharp, distinct click of my 5-inch stiletto heels striking the brick patio cut through the chaotic murmurs of the crowd. I stepped out of the shadows of the catering tent and walked slowly, deliberately down the center aisle of the pavilion. The sudden appearance of the discarded, supposedly devastated ex-wife instantly silenced the remaining whispers. 300 pairs of eyes shifted from the weeping Vanessa and the hyperventilating Marcus to my immaculate black Givenchy suit. I did not rush. I walked with the measured, inevitable pace of a corporate auditor walking into a hostile boardroom. I reached the front of the stage and calmly mounted the wooden steps. I completely ignored Vanessa, who was sobbing uncontrollably on the floor. I offered Eleanor a brief, polite nod of acknowledgement, then turned my full, unblinking attention to Marcus. The arrogant titan of industry was trembling violently. The color had completely vanished from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified child holding a stolen toy. I unzipped my black leather portfolio and pulled out the thick stack of legal-sized financial documents bound in blue corporate backing. I placed the documents gently onto the podium, right next to Vanessa's scattered fertility clinic records. I leaned slightly toward the microphone, my voice completely level, projecting a terrifying, glacial calm across the entire estate. I addressed Marcus directly. I reminded him of the boastful emails he had sent, demanding that I assume his toxic debt to protect his flawless commercial reputation. I told him that since he loved hosting grand, public audiences to celebrate his successes, I had decided to conduct a real-time public audit of his corporate ledgers. I pulled the certified execution order from the top of the stack and held it up. I explained the mechanics of the irrevocable proxy agreement to the crowd of wealthy investors and bank presidents sitting in the front rows. I stated, clearly and precisely, that 72 hours ago, I had legally executed the clawback clause he had foolishly signed 5 years prior. I had permanently extracted $25 million of foundational capital from his primary holding trust. The silence in the tent deepened into a state of absolute, morbid horror. The financial executives in the audience instantly understood the lethal implications of my words. I looked Marcus dead in the eyes and explained that by removing the core collateral, I had triggered automatic, irreversible acceleration clauses on every single secondary loan in his entire commercial portfolio. His corporate accounts were entirely drained. His ongoing construction projects were instantly insolvent. He did not own a single brick of his vaunted empire anymore. Marcus's jaw dropped, his chest heaving as he desperately tried to process the total annihilation of his net worth. He lunged forward, pointing a shaking finger at my face, opening his mouth to scream a denial. Right at that exact second, the smartphone in his tailored jacket pocket began to vibrate with violent, frantic intensity. The financial execution began, operating on sheer blind panic. Marcus fumbled with his vibrating phone. His hands were shaking so violently that he nearly dropped the expensive device onto the wooden stage. In his desperate rush to answer the call, his thumb swiped across the glass and inadvertently activated the speakerphone function. Before he could utter a single syllable, the hysterical, breathless voice of his chief financial officer exploded from the speaker, echoing loudly across the silent, horrified pavilion. The CFO sounded as though he were actively running down a hallway. He screamed that federal agents had just breached the lobby of their Boston headquarters. It was not a routine regulatory inquiry. Teams of investigators from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network were actively locking down the executive suites. They were seizing corporate servers, confiscating hard drives, and ordering all personnel to step away from their workstations. They had presented a federal warrant specifically citing massive commercial bank fraud and structured money laundering. Marcus stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish. The CFO's panicked voice continued to pour from the device, detailing the absolute catastrophe unfolding miles away. The commercial banks had just notified the finance department that every single operating account was completely frozen by federal injunction. The company payroll had instantly bounced. The federal authorities had traced the $8,500 offshore transfers directly from the Commercial Construction Fund to the Caribbean Holding Company and back to Caleb's accounts. The sophisticated financial algorithms had easily flagged the transaction loop as an illicit syndicate operation. Because Marcus was the sole registered owner of the corporate treasury, he was officially listed as the primary suspect in a federal money laundering investigation. The CFO broke down into audible, hyperventilating sobs over the speakerphone. He screamed that the institutional investors were already calling the office, threatening to file personal multi-million-dollar lawsuits against Marcus for breaching his fiduciary covenants. The company was finished. The line abruptly went dead with a sharp click. Marcus's hand went entirely limp. The shattered phone slipped from his fingers, falling onto the stage floor. 5 minutes ago. This manicured lawn was the epicenter of Southern high society, the grand debut of a brilliant billionaire's perfect new dynasty. Now, it resembled the bleak, smoking aftermath of a military airstrike. The guests were staring at him with profound, unadulterated revulsion. He had fallen from the absolute pinnacle of arrogant power into a federal nightmare in the span of 10 minutes. His empire was completely dead. Just as the crushing reality of federal prison began to settle over Marcus, a tall man in a sharp, bespoke gray suit pushed his way through the stunned crowd and stepped onto the stage. It was Marcus's private corporate defense attorney. He positioned himself directly between me and his client, projecting an aura of aggressive, practiced legal intimidation. He clearly believed that a confident, booming voice could somehow alter the mathematics of a financial collapse. The lawyer pointed a perfectly manicured finger at me, his voice echoing loudly as he attempted to seize control of the narrative. He boldly declared that my actions constituted severe corporate espionage and malicious embezzlement. He announced to the crowd that his firm would immediately file an emergency federal injunction to freeze my personal trust accounts, claiming my $25 million withdrawal was executed through fraudulent, unauthorized digital access. For a brief, pathetic second, a flicker of desperate hope returned to Marcus's bloodshot eyes. He thought his expensive bulldog could still bite his way out of the trap. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to argue. I simply maintained my calm, dignified posture, allowing a polite, almost pitying smile to touch the corners of my mouth. I reached into my black Givenchy portfolio one final time. I pulled out a heavy, watermarked document protected by a transparent sleeve. It was the original digital authentication matrix for the irrevocable proxy agreement. It bore the certified, encrypted signature seals of both the Federal Reserve Compliance Office and Marcus's own legal department from exactly 5 years ago. I handed the document directly to the aggressive attorney. I softly suggested he read the specific clause regarding unilateral execution rights in the event of documented treasury fraud. I watched as his eyes scanned the complex legal vernacular. The color drained from his face at a remarkable speed. He recognized the federal seals instantly. He realized that disputing this document in open court would not only be entirely futile, but it would practically guarantee his own disbarment for filing a frivolous injunction against a federally protected lien. The attorney slowly lowered the paper. The aggressive posture completely evaporated, replaced by the grim, professional resignation of a man who knows a case is absolutely unwinnable. He did not say another word to me. He turned around, handed the document to a trembling Marcus, and quietly stepped off the stage. He was abandoning his client to the federal authorities to save his own career. The false hope vanished completely. The lawyer quietly walked away. When a fraudulent ecosystem collapses, the predators inevitably turn on each other to survive. On the floor of the stage, Vanessa realized that her carefully curated illusion of the perfect Southern family was completely obliterated. Her survival instincts kicked in with breathtaking speed. Ignoring her crying infants, she frantically pulled out her phone, attempting to access the offshore accounts where she had hidden the embezzled $850,000. She planned to transfer the funds into an untraceable crypto wallet and flee across state lines. Instead, her screen flashed a stark, red banking error. The Internal Revenue Service had already executed a total freeze on all connected offshore assets pending the money laundering investigation. The money was gone. Vanessa let out a hysterical, agonizing shriek. She spun around, pointing a shaking finger at Marcus, her face contorted into a mask of pure hatred. She screamed that he was a failure, a fake billionaire who had dragged her into a federal crime. She publicly blamed him for everything, conveniently forgetting her own orchestration of the genetic fraud. Near the catering tent, private security guards had already cornered Caleb, preventing him from fleeing to the parking lot. Local law enforcement sirens began to wail in the distance, cutting through the heavy southern humidity. The wealthy guests were hastily retreating toward their luxury vehicles, desperate to distance their own reputations from the toxic, radioactive fallout of the Montgomery family scandal. Eleanor was sitting completely frozen at her table, weeping silently into her hands as she watched her legacy burn to the ground. Marcus fell to his knees on the wooden stage. The bespoke Tom Ford suit was wrinkled, his perfectly styled hair falling in messy strands across his sweating forehead. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal, the financial ruin, and the impending federal indictments had finally broken his fragile mind. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his face, his voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate whimper. He begged me to call off the lawyers. He begged me to help him untangle the federal mess, promising he would give up everything just to stay out of prison. He told me I was the only person who truly understood him. I looked down at his sobbing, broken silhouette. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no lingering anger, no residual sorrow, and certainly no pity. He was simply a fully amortized bad debt, a closed file from a fiscal year that had already been successfully audited. I zipped my black leather portfolio shut, turned my back on the chaotic stage, and began walking down the center aisle. His agonizing pleas echoed behind me. I never looked back once. 3 days later, I was back in the quiet, climate-controlled environment of my Boston penthouse. The financial news networks were dominating their broadcasts, with the spectacular, multi-agency raid on Marcus's corporate headquarters. The media meticulously detailed the scandalous collapse of his marriage, the fraudulent fertility payments, and the staggering volume of his defaulted commercial loans. His name was permanently synonymous with corporate deceit. But my focus was no longer on his destruction. It was time to finalize the reconstruction. Because I had formally executed the clawback clause before the federal government froze his operational accounts, I was legally classified as the primary secured creditor in his bankruptcy proceedings. This meant my liquidated $25 million was entirely protected from the fallout. I did not intend to simply hoard the capital. True justice requires restitution for the innocent collateral damage. I pulled up the legal documentation regarding Gloria's historic retirement home and the secondary dividend contract Marcus had maliciously canceled. I contacted my attorneys and authorized an immediate, unconditional transfer of funds. We bought out the entirety of Gloria's aggressive mortgage directly from her lending institution, paying it off in full. I then established an ironclad, independent lifetime annuity trust in her name, heavily overfunded to ensure she would receive a generous monthly dividend that no family member could ever access or alter. The legal framework was pristine, designed specifically to shield her from the radioactive ruins of the Montgomery family. Later that afternoon, my secure phone rang. It was Gloria. When I answered, she could barely speak through her tears of profound, overwhelming relief. She had received the certified deeds from the bank confirming she owned her home free and clear. She thanked me repeatedly, calling me her guardian angel. I listened to the genuine warmth in her voice, feeling a deep, quiet satisfaction settle into my bones. I gently reminded her that she did not owe me anything. She had risked her own survival to help me 5 years ago when I needed capital to save the company. I was merely balancing the ledger, ensuring that her remarkable kindness was met with absolute protection. I told her to enjoy her garden, to drink her sweet tea on the porch, and to never let another corporate document frighten her again. I ended the call with a soft, genuine smile. The auditing process was finally complete. The innocent were finally safe. 6 months passed, sweeping away the last lingering remnants of the chaos like autumn leaves. I stood by the expansive, floor-to-ceiling windows of my newly acquired commercial suite in downtown Boston. The space was beautiful, bathed in warm, natural light, featuring minimalist oak furniture and abstract art. It was not a sterile, corporate cage designed to appease a fragile ego. It was a sanctuary of intellect and purpose. This was the headquarters of the Vanguard Legal and Financial Defense Fund, an institution I had built entirely from the ground up using my recovered capital. The fund specialized exclusively in providing elite forensic accounting and aggressive corporate litigation services to women who were being financially exploited or suffocated within high net worth marriages. I hired the sharpest, most ruthless female attorneys and auditors in the state. We tracked hidden offshore accounts, unraveled fraudulent prenuptial agreements, and enforced legal boundaries with surgical precision. We became the invisible sword for those who had been conditioned to believe that their only option was a quiet, penniless surrender. I walked over to the break room and brewed a fresh shot of dark espresso. The aroma filled the quiet office, a scent that no longer reminded me of desperate, anxiety-fueled all-nighters, but of peaceful, deliberate mornings. I was no longer a shadow standing behind a mediocre man, desperately trying to construct a fortress to hide his incompetence. I was the architect of my own reality. I had absolute autonomy over my schedule, my capital, and my emotional bandwidth. I had received a brief update from my attorney regarding the Charleston fallout. Marcus was currently navigating the brutal reality of a massive federal indictment, stripped of all his assets and living in a cheap suburban motel while awaiting trial. Vanessa had abandoned him completely the moment the money vanished, only to find herself embroiled in her own legal nightmares regarding the stolen corporate funds. The aristocratic Montgomery family had entirely excommunicated them both, preferring to pretend they did not exist to salvage whatever tiny shred of societal dignity they had left. I took a slow sip of the hot espresso, feeling the rich, bitter warmth slide down my throat. I did not feel any lingering desire to check their social media or read the legal updates. Their misery was no longer my concern. They were trapped in a prison entirely of their own making. I walked back to my desk, sitting down in my plush leather chair, preparing to review a new case file for a client who desperately needed her own financial liberation. I was finally completely free. The afternoon sun began to dip below the Boston skyline, casting long, golden shadows across the polished oak of my desk. I closed the final case file of the day, resting my hands quietly on the leather surface, looking back at the brutal sequence of events that had consumed the past year. I realized the most profound shift was not the recovery of $25 million, nor was it the spectacular, public destruction of my betrayers. The true transformation occurred in the fundamental way I defined my own value. For years, I had allowed society, and a deeply insecure man, to dictate the parameters of a successful life. I was told that true womanhood meant sacrificing my intellect to maintain the fragile illusion of a happy home. I was told that setting boundaries was cold, and that demanding accountability was heartless. But navigating the absolute collapse of my marriage taught me the most vital lesson of all. Grace is not synonymous with silent suffering. Loyalty is not a blank check to be continuously overdrawn by those who refuse to respect you. When you strip away the romanticized notions of passive forgiveness, you are left with the cold, unyielding reality of process. Justice does not magically arrive because you cry loud enough or because you occupy the moral high ground. Justice arrives because you meticulously organize your evidence, you refuse to react to emotional manipulation, and you execute your strategy with absolute, uncompromising precision. You protect the innocent, you reclaim what is legally yours, and you walk away without a single backward glance. Legacy isn't what you blindly inherit or desperately fake. It's what you have the intellect to build and the courage to protect. The empire I lost was built on lies, ego, and exploitation. The empire I stand in today is built on truth, resilience, and the unshakable foundation of my own competence. No one can ever take credit for my labor again, and no one will ever mistake my silence for weakness. The audit is complete. The accounts are perfectly balanced, and the future belongs entirely to me. If you believe that true power lies in walking away and rebuilding on your own terms, share this story. Thank you for listening tonight.